So thank you, Martin, for your willingness to do this interview.
Very happy to do it.
We are a very special location. We are in the heart of the Vatican City. Why are we here?
Well, we're here in the Vatican because the Vatican has an Academy of Science called the Pontifical Academy of Science, which has conferences on various topics. And the members are 70 or 80 scientists from all over the world, of all faiths and none. So it's a really global academy, and we have scientific discussions. But I think one useful thing we can do is address issues of social import, where if we can interest the authorities in the Vatican, it can make a difference. And to give one example, we had a conference 18 months ago in May 2014 on sustainability, climate and the environment. And this got traction within the Vatican. And it then led to the papal encyclical in mid-2015, which of course was a very important influence on the Paris Environmental and Climate Conference in December 2015, because of course the Pope has immense traction, especially in Latin America, Africa and East Asia. And I think the fact that the Pope had come out strongly in favour of the importance of concern about climate and our duties to the environment had a big effect in easing the path to consensus at the Paris conference. So that's an example where the Pontifical Academy can, I think, have a more distinctive role than other national academies. But we also have meetings on cosmology and other subjects like that.
Were you kind of surprised that, particularly in this kind of climate change debate, Pope Francis kind of came out as such a strong, I would almost say, voice of reason in a world that's sometimes very confused?
Well, I think it was surprising and gratifying because the other point that came out in that encyclical was humanity's duty to the environment. And of course, although Franciscans have had that view, the Church itself has had the line that men have dominion over nature, as it were.
Yes.
So the statement fairly clearly that the environment has a value in its own right, and we have an obligation to defend it, is something which I think was not clearly apparent in earlier Catholic statements.
So not only I would say kind of the environment and human beings taking care of nature, there's also a very specific angle in terms of global inequity and the fact that the poor were mostly affected by these issues.
Yes, well, that's right. I think, of course, the things that everyone can agree about the Church is that it's got a global perspective, it thinks long term, and it cares about the world's poor.
Yes.
And in the context of climate change, of course, the main victims of it will be the poor, and the concern is something which is not short term. We're concerned about future generations because they're the ones who will bear the impact of climate change. And so the Church really has all the prerequisites to be a body that can have a real global influence on this debate.
Do you feel any tension between faith and science, particularly if you're here?
I don't think there is any tension because, of course, the Church used to, of course, be concerned. I mean, until 25 years ago, it wasn't good to talk too much about Galileo, but things have changed completely now. Yes. And the Church is very happy to engage in debates on issues like evolution and cosmology, etc. And I'm a cosmologist, yes. So they're quite happy to talk about the Big Bang. So,
talking about the Big Bang and cosmology, it's kind of striking that one of the previous presidents of this academy, Georges Lemaitre, he was both an ordained priest, but he was also, in some sense, the father of the expanding universe and the Big Bang. So, yes. In that sense, perhaps that's a surprise for people to hear.
It is surprising, and he was in fact a very remarkable scientist who studied in Cambridge at MIT, and then he worked at Louvain in Belgium for his career, and he became president of this academy. But he was indeed one of the early people who applied Einstein's theory to models of the universe and had the idea of a Big Bang, which he called the primeval atom. Yes. And he thought very deeply about these questions and came up with models which are still part of the folklore of the subject, as it were.
And Einstein didn't like his ideas to begin with, right?
No, it's rather interesting. Einstein actually was rather reluctant to accept all the most exciting conclusions of his theory. He never liked black holes, for instance, but he didn't like the idea of the expanding universe. He wanted a static universe, and also he, although he introduced this thing called the cosmic constant, which is a latent force in empty space, he didn't like it, and Lemaitre tried to argue that it was some effect that might be genuine. And Lemaitre has turned out to be right, because one of the great discoveries of the last 15 years has been that this force in empty space does exist and is very important for the future of the universe.
So what do you think of the fact that Einstein was very brilliant? That in some sense, could you say that his theory was even more clever than he was?
It was, because Einstein, of course, through his huge insight, developed this theory, but its consequences took decades to be fully understood. And things like black holes, the Big Bang, and gravitational waves, which are regarded now as the great confirmatory tests of the theory, in all three cases, Einstein was negative or ambivalent.
And also in all three cases, it's only recently that we got convincing evidence. So can you say something about what the state of cosmology is, if you really think about it in terms of the long-term development? I mean, humankind has been thinking about the cosmos for millennia.
Yes, yes.
But what's happening right at this moment?
Yes. Well, of course, it is interesting, as you say, that Einstein's theory was special, and he was uniquely original as a scientist, because he came up with this theory as a result mainly of pure thought. It wasn't stimulated by puzzling experiments.
Did
in
it
the way
come
that
like
most
100 years too early, so to say?
Yeah, certainly 50 years too early.
50 years too early.
Had it not been for Einstein,
Yes.
then the theory would not have been developed for decades. And indeed, it wasn't until the 1960s that astronomers found the first entities in the universe where Einstein's effect was important, rather than just being a tiny correction to Newton's theory. In the 1960s, we found objects called neutron stars, stars the mass of the sun but squeezed down to the diameter of a few kilometers, and also black holes, objects which had collapsed, cutting themselves off from the rest of the universe but leaving a gravitational imprint frozen in the space they left. And evidence for these things emerged in the 60s and 70s, and also evidence emerged that our universe had evolved from some very dense hot state. This was so-called background radiation, which fills the universe and is a relic of the hot, dense beginnings of the universe. And this is what Lemaitre had speculated about much earlier, but the evidence came in the 60s. So from the 60s onwards, there were phenomena which required Einstein's theory in order to interpret them properly. And so the theory changed from being rather a sort of backwater out of the mainstream of physics to being one of the real frontiers of theoretical physics.
I read somewhere an obituary of Einstein that at the time of his death of 1955, people admired his work as a great piece of art, which is something for scientists is quite a put down, right? Because you don't want to be you want to actually be a theory of the world, of the universe.
Yes, but it was a great piece of creative thinking. Of course, there's a lot of discussion about creativity in the sciences versus in the arts. Of course, most creativity in the arts is more distinctive, but in the sciences, Einstein was more creative in that he made more difference. Normally in science, if A didn't do something, B would do it very quickly. That was true of quantum theory.
Right, yes, it was more collective effort.
Yes, but in the case of Einstein's relativity, if he hadn't done it, then the idea would not have emerged for decades.
Particularly, I think, for general relativity.
That's right, and one of my favourite scientific writers, Peter Medawar, the great biologist, and he put this rather well. He said that the difference between the arts and sciences is like this, that if you are doing science, then if you don't discover something, then someone else will discover the same thing soon. Whereas when Wagner was in the middle of the Ring cycle, he took 10 years off to write Tristan and Meistersingers, and he didn't think anyone would scoop him on Götterdämmerung. And so that's the difference. In the arts, your work is individualistic, even if it doesn't last, whereas in the sciences, your work is durable, it's part of some growing edifice, but it loses its individuality. And if you hadn't done it, then someone else would have done it fairly soon. And Einstein is perhaps one of the few exceptions in that he did make a more distinctive imprint on 20th century science than anyone else.
Well, one thing which is fascinating, I sometimes use the metaphor of finding the beginning of a roll of Scotch tape, which is very difficult, and then you can unroll.
Yes.
And so if you think of this unrolling tape, particularly for cosmology, which is now like 100 years since Einstein's work on general relativity, we have this explosion of results, of ideas. Where are we, so to say, in understanding the big picture? Do you feel we are just at the beginning, we're halfway? What's your feeling?
Well, of course, we're always at the beginning of science, because as the frontiers advance, their periphery gets longer and a new set of questions comes in.
About understanding, say, the fundamental principles of the universe.
Yes. Well, I think we've made huge progress, certainly since I was a student 40 years ago, when we didn't know if there was a Big Bang at all.
Yes.
One thing we've learnt, of course, is that the universe in the scales that we can observe does have a certain uniformity.
Yes.
We've learnt that the atoms in a distant galaxy are just the same as the atoms in the lab.
Yes.
Were that not the case, of course, were the universe more anarchic, we'd not make any progress at all. But we've learnt about that. We've also learnt that all the galaxies in the universe and all the stars can be traced back to a common origin in this hot, dense beginning, the so-called Big Bang, and we can now date that to be 13.8 billion years ago.
Yes.
And so we can trace out the history of the universe from the hot, dense beginning to the present, and we can also understand how, from these amorphous beginnings, the first structures formed as the universe cooled down and condensed into the first galaxies and stars. And we have a very good theory for this, and we can actually test the theory in a number of ways. We can look back with our telescopes to objects so far away that their light set out when the universe was at its present age, and we have evidence of the much earlier universe from studying in detail this background radiation at the beginning. And we get a very consistent picture going back to when the universe was smooth apart from tiny fluctuations, and to the stage when those fluctuations have enhanced their density contrast to make galaxies. And this is a consistent picture, and it also tells us that the universe contains the ordinary atoms that we know about, and also contains about 5 times as much stuff in the form of what's called dark matter, particles which have no electric charge and don't interact much, they just move around under gravity. We don't know what particles they are. They're still a mystery, but we know for sure that the dynamics of galaxies is dominated by this dark matter.
Are you personally surprised that we came so far, that we have such a complete picture of the universe? I mean, you could imagine, there are just some formidable obstacles in learning about our own universe.
Yes. Well, I think it is gratifying and it's surprising in a number of ways. First, of course, we owe the advances 95% to improvements in technology and instrumentation. Armchair theory doesn't get you very far by itself.
Yes.
I mean, none of us are as wise as Einstein. We've got further because we've had better instruments.
And he didn't even believe his own consequences of a theory, right?
That's right. So
only after experimental evidence.
Yes, that's right. So
became they clear for him too.
That's right. So we depend on that. But I think at a more fundamental level, what is gratifying is that our minds, which haven't changed very much since our ancestors roamed the African savannas tens of thousands of years ago, can cope not just with the everyday world that we evolved to cope with, but can cope with the counterintuitive world of the quantum and also of the cosmos. So it's surprising that the world is such that we can understand both the micro and the cosmic. What we haven't yet quite understood is how to link those together. As you know better than me, the challenge of 21st century physics is to have a unified theory which combines what Einstein did, which gives us a good picture of the large-scale universe and gravity, with the quantum world.
Are you optimistic that this will proceed? Are you expecting at some point there will be a sign forbidden for human beings?
Well,
human scientists.
Well, you can judge far better than me how likely it is that string theory will deliver the goods, where some other theory will. I think it's very good that there are some people who believe that this may happen, because otherwise they would be motivated to try.
Yes.
If they're not motivated, they'll never succeed. So it's very good that there are people, including many of our friends and colleagues,
yes.
who are working on ideas of unified theories, and I hope they will succeed. But I think we have to be open-minded about whether there are deep aspects of reality which are going to be beyond our capacity to grasp, because after all, I mean, a monkey can't understand quantum theory,
yes.
and there may be some deep features of reality which we just can't comprehend.
That we are as hopeless as monkeys to
Yes.
get there. You think that we'll ever discover these things, or they are almost by definition outside our realm? Because monkeys probably will also not lament that they can't understand quantum mechanics.
Well, that's right, and we're not aware of these things,
Yes.
but there may be aspects of nature which we're not aware of, and that, of course, may mean that there are discoveries that will be left to brains better than ours, some
yes.
kind of post-human entities which may come into existence
We'll
one
come
day.
to that. So clearly, you know, this is quite amazing. That this is human beings on planet Earth looking at the universe. Do you think there is science elsewhere in the universe? Scientists elsewhere?
Well, of course, we don't know. I mean, I think we can say more in answer to that question than we could have done 20 years ago.
Yes.
Because one thing we've certainly learned, which is a great discovery in the last 20 years, is that most of the stars which we see are orbited by retinues of planets,
yes.
just as the Sun is orbited by the Earth and the other familiar planets. And it's quite likely that in our Milky Way galaxy, there are 1 billion planets, rather like the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Earth in the sense they're about the size of the Earth, and at the distance from their parent star, such that water can exist, neither boiling away nor staying frozen.
So they are as comfortable to our kind of life
Right, as
planet
potential
Earth.
habitats, but of course being habitable is not the same as being inhabited.
Yes.
And of course, one of the key scientific questions which is not understood yet is the origin of life,
Yes.
even on Earth. I mean, we understand how from the simplest organisms over 3.5 billion years or so, our biosphere of which we are a part has emerged. But what is still not understood is the actual origin, the transition from complex chemistry to the first metabolizing, replicating
yes.
structures. And that's one of these problems that everyone has known is important, but it's been put in the, as it were, too difficult box.
Is it, I mean, it's very difficult to say, of
Yes.
course, but do you feel this is a problem that it's kind of, it's foreseeable that, say, within the next decade?
I think it is now. Yes, because I think, unlike the past, now there are serious people working on it.
Yes.
So I'm hopeful that within 10 or 20 years, we will understand how that key transition from biochemistry to the first replicating, metabolizing structures happened. I think we will understand that because it's no longer thought premature. And so chemists, aided by experiments and computer experiments,
yes.
are making progress. And of course, when we understand that, which of course is an exciting discovery for even the most earthbound biologists, it'll tell us two things. It'll tell us, was it a rare fluke?
Yes.
Or would this have happened in some other planet like the Earth?
Because life originated remarkably fast after the moment it was possible. Right?
Well, it seems it's a simple life did.
Yes.
Multicellular took longer, and that, of course, does indicate that it wasn't a rare fluke and did happen. And so we will understand that. But another thing we might understand 10, 20 years from now is whether the chemical basis of all life on Earth, DNA and RNA and all that, is sort of uniquely special,
yes.
or whether there could be life out there which
all
could
the
be quite
mechanisms.
different. Yes. Could there even be methane-based life on Titan, which is a moon of Jupiter?
And it's exciting that again we are in a position where some of these questions can be asked and answered experimentally. Right?
Well, that's right, because although we can't quite do it yet, within 10 years we'll have telescopes powerful enough to actually take the spectrum of the light from a planet around another star and get some feel for, is there oxygen there, is the surface green, and things like that. So we will learn whether there is vegetation or life of some kind of photosynthesis going on these other planets around other stars, and that'll be a huge discovery.
So I know, and as a scientist, you have to, you're very much aware of all the uncertainties, and that experiments will tell us what. But as a cosmologist, if you think about the cosmos, what's your personal kind of, I would almost say gut feeling? What's your personal intuition? You think that the universe is populated also with intelligent life?
Well, I think we know so little that it's would be foolish to lay definite odds. But yes, okay. But leaving that aside, I mean, I think if you ask me to bet, I would bet that sort of simple life is probably widespread. But of course, going from simple life to life like us, which is self-aware and intelligent, we don't know how like that was, because evolutionary biologists debate about the contingencies that were involved in our emergence.
Right.
They ask the question.
Critical points where, in some sense, life has to go over a certain threshold.
That's right. And if the dinosaurs hadn't been wiped out, would intelligence have developed somewhere else, or were these contingencies crucial? So we do. And if evolution were rerun on the Earth, then would it end up the same, or would it end up quite different? And so that's an uncertainty, which means that even if the simple life, we don't know how likely it is that it would evolve into anything that became intelligent. But then, of course, there's another question, because one thing which astronomy does tell us is that the time lying ahead is at least as long as the time that's elapsed up till now. Our sun has been shining for 4.5 billion years, but it'll be about 6 billion before it flares up and engulfs the inner planets and wipes out any life remaining on the Earth. And so no astronomer could really believe that we humans are the culmination of evolution. So
it continues.
It continues, and we've no idea what's going to happen. I mean, if we think of what might happen on the Earth, then of course, well, the pessimistic outcome is we wipe ourselves out. But the more optimistic scenario is that development continues. But if development continues beyond humans like us, it won't be Darwinian selection. It will be controlled technology-driven evolution by future developments in gene editing and also cyborgs and artificial intelligence. And
Let me talk a little bit about that, but I think that's a very interesting phase that our civilization is. No, technology was always around.
Yes.
But you can definitely say that, it's kind of growing exponentially fast. And I want to come to the topic where I feel personally that we are moving away from a phase where we understood basically the building blocks of matter and life and perhaps the universe, towards a phase where we start kind of rearranging these building blocks.
Right.
So you already mentioned we understood living organisms, but I think now in the lab we try to create parts or perhaps whole living cells. And so you feel this is kind of in some sense a phase transition. This is a radical change.
I think it is. I think that this century is special for a number of reasons. It's the first when we could create species quite different from any that we now exist. It's the first when maybe artificial intelligence, electronic intelligence, may start to compete with the level of intelligence in the hardware in our skulls. And it's also, of course, the century when, for the first time, life can spread from the Earth to other places in the solar system. So this is a special century, even in the cosmic perspective, where there have been 45 million centuries already since the Earth formed, and there will be at least that number in the future. So this century is very special. And
can you say something about what you see as future developments, not in many centuries, but say, for instance, the next decades? Because some of these developments are going incredibly fast, and perhaps we are not even, or the general public not even aware what is possible right now. So, for instance, thinking both of life and intelligence, how do you see this happening in the coming years, and how will it impact us?
Well, I'm not an expert on either of these topics, but I think but I think it's clear that our understanding of genetics and our ability to actually synthesize new genomes and modify existing genomes is developing very fast, to the extent it will be possible to almost design new species or design very heavily modified species and adapt our progeny. And that's going to happen. In parallel, there's another quite separate development, which is advancing computers from being just calculating machines to being objects which can undertake what's called generalized machine learning.
Yes.
And we've seen developments of this. I mean, the most
spectacular examples.
Well, indeed. And of course, to think of some key steps in this, it's 20 years since a computer beat Kasparov, the world chess champion.
Yes.
That was done by the program being made by expert chess players, etc. And the computer could work through millions of moves fast. But
we taught the computer how to play chess.
Yes,
right?
yes. Whereas what happened this year was a computer beat the world champion at a game of Go. And this is another very challenging game.
More
challenging, yes. But the big difference was that in this case, the computer was not programmed in detail. It was really given the general rules, but then it watched hundreds of thousands of games and then played against itself and got better. So the people who devised the program, they didn't understand why it made some particular clever moves which enabled it to beat the world champion. And so this is an example where the computer is sort of teaching itself by being able to crunch huge amounts of data. And in the same way, translation is now done, not by giving the computer the details of vocabulary and syntax, but by getting it to read millions of pages. I mean, they give millions of pages of European Union documents in different languages. It never gets bored, it just reads all these and eventually learns to translate.
It's a perfect civil servant.
That's right. So this generalized machine learning is...
Are you worried about the fact that these machines who beat people at Go or in language skills, they are basically not able to tell us how they did this, right? I mean, they're not able to instruct us. They just intuitively learn how to do this. In fact, the way a child learns to speak a language. You can speak the language, but you're not able to write down the grammar.
Yes.
Are you worried about that when machines are doing more and more of that stuff, which will be extremely convenient, that they're kind of autonomous, that they just go their own ways?
Well, I think there is a worry because there's some things which they will be able to do better than humans, like already the way the quantitative hedge funds steal money off us is by being able to analyse more data than a human being can, and of course that's going to get better and better as they can see tiny correlations.
They will take advantages of our weaknesses.
That's right. Well, they're doing that already, but they'll do it to a great extent. But I think we've got to bear in mind that still they don't really have human level generality of intelligence. They do some things, and of course the other point is that robots are still clumsy. I mean, they can't move around the pieces on the real chessboard as well as a child can. And so there's a long way to go before machines can actually interact with the external world.
One thing I liked of this game, Go game between the computer and that the fifth game actually was won by the Go champion, because he felt, I'm not going to win, I have to do some crazy stuff. So he actually did something. So this fifth game might be something that somehow brought out the unique human qualities.
Well, that's right. Yes, humans is more flexible.
Yes.
And of course there are many things which the machines can't do. But of course the problem, as I understand it, is going to be to ensure that machines have common sense.
Yes.
Because there are many things that we understand about the world. For instance, I was told that the computer that had beaten the American champion in this TV game, called Jeopardy, which is yes, and I don't know this game, but it's less mindless than most than most TV games. But it was asked the question, which is bigger, a shoebox or Mount Everest, and couldn't say. Because it has no conception.
It could be gigantic, cosmic shoebox.
Yes, it had no conception of the everyday world. And another simple example it's given is that if you have one of these robots in your home,
yes.
Which is supposed to sort of make sure that your fridge is stored up and the heating's on and the food's ready when you come home, if it's run out of meat, it may put the cat in the oven. Because it may not realise that there's some things that are not appropriate. And so one of the
chicken in the oven is fine.
Yes, right. So one of the issues really for the people developing AI is to ensure that it does learn what human ethics and human attitudes are, which it's either got to be able to learn those sort of things.
I know when Garry Kasparov was asked, he lost this game, chess game against the computer, that, it's not man against machine, but he said, well, it's me and the machine against somebody else. So in some sense, is that a better image in our mind, that we should kind of start to collaborate with these machines?
I think so, because I think Kasparov says that a human plus a machine is best, and I think that's going to be to happen. But there are these nightmare scenarios of the machines taking over, and of course, the kind of thing which I think is not too futuristic is if we have a system of a city where all the public services and the transport is controlled in some smart way, and the whole thing could go wrong, and so we're very vulnerable. And one of the downsides, of course, of all these developments, and indeed of the modern interconnected world, is that we are more vulnerable because everything is interconnected.
Just we go there in a moment, but if you think about this issue of, we talked about nature, about the origins of life, the cosmic evolution.
Yes.
Now we're developing technology. Again, from a cosmic perspective, do you see difference between what nature is doing and what we are doing?
Well, I think in a sense we're going to take over from nature, because if we think of what may happen, not in the next 50 years, but maybe in the next 200 or 300 years, then it may well be that humans turn into sort of cyborgs, or that the electronic machines take over completely, because obviously they don't have all the features of the human brain, but they have the advantage of speed compared to the human brain. And so it could be that the future will lie with electronic machines, not organic creatures like us. And I personally think, if you ask me my most likely scenario for the next 100 years, I think that there will be in 100 years a few people living on Mars. There'll be people who are real adventurers. They'll have to cope with a very hostile climate and very conditions for which...
Old-fashioned explorers.
Yes, right, but they're in an environment for which their bodies are ill-adapted.
Yes.
And I think they will use all the technology we'll then have to adapt to that new environment, whether that'll be by cyborg techniques, by downloading their brains into a machine or something like that. And I think it'll happen there because we're probably going to want to control, for ethical or prudential reasons, the adoption of these technologies here on Earth. Whereas if you have these people beyond the range of any such regulation, we'd wish them good luck in doing this, and they've got the biggest motivation. So my scenario would be that within a few hundred years, there will be entities that we would call post-human, in that they'll be very different from us, so they'll be a new species. And if they are electronic and not organic, then of course they may not want to be on a planet at all. They may be happier under zero gravity somewhere else, and that'll be the future. And so if you then think in terms of the cosmic perspective of time, when there are millions of centuries ahead, then the way things will look is that we had 45 million centuries, and then for a few tens or hundreds of centuries, organic civilization evolved, developed technology, and then it was taken over by machines, and they have billions of years, millions of centuries ahead. And so this has an implication also if we are thinking there might be intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. I mean, as I said, I think there's probably simple life, but if there's intelligent life, will there be? And I think if we detect any kind of evidence for something artificial beyond our solar system, then it is more likely to be these machines. Because if the evolution on this other planet had tracked what happened on the Earth, then it's unlikely to be synchronized.
Yes.
If they're a billion years behind, then there's...
Because there's only this brief window, in some sense, where nature and technology are working at the same time.
That's right. So,
which is our current age.
That's right. So if they're behind us, then there'll be no evidence for any technology. If they're ahead of us, then they will have got way into this machine age. And so I think it would be unlikely that we would detect any other external intelligence which is anywhere like us. So I think the normal talk about these aliens who are sort of bipeds with eyes on stalks, maybe, that's not very realistic.
Unnecessary.
Yep.
This phase that we're currently in is just a phase of the evolution of life, which is necessary to spread from planet Earth through the universe. We need, it's only through technology that we can actually really spread around.
That's right, because clearly as humans we are not adapted to long voyages, whereas if you're a machine near immortal, then these long distance voyages, if you want to make them, are going to be possible. But of course this leads to another point, the famous Fermi paradox argument, which is that if indeed life on Earth was not unique, then why haven't we seen evidence for the aliens which had a head start over us?
Yes.
And indeed this is a serious constraint, and this does lead me to suspect that perhaps intelligent life is rare. And if that's the case, of course, then it makes what happens here on Earth even more important, because it clearly matters to us as human beings, but it could be cosmically important, because in this century what happens will determine whether life takes this next step and jump-starts post-human evolution away from the Earth and in inorganic form, or whether we sort of snuff things out or go back to the Stone Age.
Yes.
And that would foreclose these potentials for what might happen in the far future.
Martin, thinking about this phase where technology is becoming more and more important and might even taking over what we do here, how do you see this from the point of view of evolution? Is this another phase in evolution?
It's a different kind, because we've evolved from simple life through Darwinian selection over 3.5 billion years. But of course for human beings, Darwinian selection has stopped anyway. But future evolution will be technological. It'll be through modifying the genome and cyborg technology when we plug into machines, etc. And so this will happen in a directed way on the technological timescale, and therefore much faster, because Darwinian selection takes about 1 million years for a species to form, evolve, and go extinct, whereas changes to humanity and the emergence of post-humans could take just centuries.
Talking about centuries, you wrote a book with the title Our Final Century. In fact, I think in the UK it was Our Final Hour, or the other way around.
The other way around.
No,
so, the Americans like instant gratification and the reverse. So,
an hour.
Yes.
But it's you talked about the dangers that are coming with these rapid developments in technology. Can you say something about what you see as the dangers, and why is this particular century, this 21st century, so crucial?
Yes. Well, I think there are two kinds of dangers which are new to us this century. One is that we are collectively putting graver pressures on the environment, because there are more of us, each of us more demanding of energy and resources, and that's why we worry about climate change, loss of biodiversity, and issues like that.
Is that dangerous to the planet, or is it dangerous to us?
It's dangerous to us, I mean, not to the planet.
The planet will survive.
The planet will survive, yes. But maybe in a depleted state, because if biodiversity is reduced, then it'll be a less exciting planet in that sense.
We had massive extinction.
Yes, that's right. So it may have to start again from an early stage. So one class of threats are those we are causing collectively. But the other kind, which I've focused on a bit more in my book, are the threats that emerge from powerful technologies, which empower individuals or small groups. Of course, we had the nuclear weapons, which are the outcome of 20th century technology, which of course changed the global political scene.
Which was also a pretty close call.
It was a pretty close call, yes.
If you would rerun history, it's not obvious that we would survive again.
Absolutely. We were just, as McNamara said, they were lucky as well as wise at the time of Cuba.
Yes.
And we might be less lucky less time. And of course, that threat is just in abeyance, because we could imagine a new standoff between new superpowers handled less luckily than the Cuba crisis. So that's one threat. But I think 21st century technologies face us with new threats, in particular biotechnology, because biotechnology, of course, is very powerful. But we can now edit a genome, and there's something called gain-of-function technology where you can make, say, the influenza virus more virulent and more transmissible. And these techniques are widely understood. Biohacking is even a student sport in some places, and they don't need huge special purpose facilities. So whereas you can monitor the misuse of nuclear technology, you can't make a H-bomb in your garage, as it were. It's very hard to monitor the misuse of bio and cyber. And that's what worries me, that by error or by terror, then a small group or even an individual could cause some sort of global disaster.
What about the whole realm of information and the way we share information, our communication technology, perhaps also intelligent networks?
Yes.
What do you feel about
Well, we are vulnerable, of course, because we depend on global networks for manufacturing, etc., and the financial system, etc. And we know that cyber attacks can already be very serious for these. And that's going to be aggravated, I think, as time goes on, as we become more dependent on information technology and networks.
You feel we are in a certain kind of arms race with technology between kind of the good and the bad applications? Because many of these issues you mentioned need, again, technology to control.
Well, they do indeed. It's a kind of arms race. And I think the worry I have is that it's not obvious that the good side is going to win. And I think we can predict, unfortunately, a growing tension between freedom, privacy and security.
Yes.
If we are to avoid the misuse. And I worry not so much about organised state actors as about individual disaffected groups. And my worst nightmare, for instance, would be someone who was an ecology fanatic who thought there were too many human beings in the world. Yes. And someone with those attitudes combined with fanaticism might say, well, let's cut down the number of human beings in the world by releasing some engineered virus.
And technologically, this is feasible.
It's becoming feasible.
Yes.
Yes.
You feel also that there is this a purely technological matter, or is there also some kind of a moral dimension to it?
Well, obviously, it would be immoral to do anything like that.
But can we do something there? Also as scientists?
Yes. Well, I think, obviously, as politicians, have an extra incentive to minimize the number of disaffected people with grievances, who are just the kind of people who will do this. So the challenge on politicians is much greater, because a small minority, which could be overwhelmed by traditional power, can, of course, fight back using these technologies. And I think this is a real problem. But as regards what scientists can do as such, I think scientists, they're not tremendously wise forecasters always, but they can look ahead a bit more and foresee what are going to be the threats. Indeed, the book I wrote 13 years ago, I'm glad it stood up quite well in that sense. But I think we can foresee what the threats are going to be, and perhaps distinguish better than lay people between what is science fiction and what is something we need to worry about.
Is it just sketching scenarios, or it's also taking the next step and perhaps try to convince people to take a certain direction?
Well, I think it's trying to convince people and politicians. And here again, I think we've got to think that scientists have an advantage because their work is more global.
Yes.
They're more international. I mean, even in the depth of the Cold War, there were fairly open links between scientists on either side of the Iron Curtain. So science is a global culture which transcends all barriers of faith and nationality more easily than other cultures. So we have that advantage, and we share common attitudes, and we can advise our governments. But I think we've got to bear in mind that most of the decisions which politicians have to take involve some science, whether they're on energy, health, environment, etc. But they're not just science.
Not just science. So they have to combine the various components
to
a decision.
That's right. And of course, on those other components, scientists are just citizens. They have no special right to be heard.
Yes.
And that's why I think it's very important that all citizens should have enough feeling for science and probability and risk and things like that, so that they can't be bamboozled too easily by experts, and that they can take part in the debate.
If you look at this kind of conversation between science and society, you might argue, even looking back on 2016, it was not such a good year for reason. Right. That's, so are we losing that debate? I'm
not sure. I think the challenges are getting harder, but I think in an issue where science is an important component, like in climate change, energy policy, health, use of genetics, I think we're doing not too badly. But I think the important thing to realize is that scientists can't themselves decide. And here, scientists can probably have more influence, not by talking directly to a politician or a minister, but through influencing the public consensus. Because politicians, they can dismiss experts, but they can't so easily dismiss something which is in the press every day or which is in their inbox every day from the public.
So you mean engaging the public at large?
Yeah, I think engaging the public at large is a prerequisite for these science-related issues to stay on the agenda, especially when they're long-term and global, like climate change and environment and energy. So I think that's crucially important. And I think if the public doesn't understand the basics of science, then this debate can't really get beyond slogans, and the public can't really be informed citizens.
You feel that we also should be able to share some of the values of science, and actually what are the values of science for you personally?
Well, of course, the values are fairly limited in the sense of honesty and curiosity, etc. So I don't think there are many values which a scientist needs to have, which are not also demanded of other professionals. But I think in science there is this tradition of transnational contacts and open debate and willingness to be proved wrong. And I think we should encourage those views. And also a feeling of probabilities, because one of the difficulties in public discourse is that people don't distinguish between something which is so unlikely that it's not worth worrying about and things which are worth worrying about, because even if unlikely, they are so catastrophic if they happen that we need to be concerned about them.
So one thing I'm personally worried about is this kind of this paradox that when science and technology is progressing, we learn more and more. The things we learn are kind of quite detailed and technical, almost by definition. They are, because they're new, they're not easy to understand.
That's right.
On the other hand, all the applications of science are more and more in our lives. So science, on the one hand, it's kind of moving away from us because of increased complexity. On the other hand, it's coming closer because of its relevance. So how do we deal with it? How can we make people understand science if, on the other hand, only a few individuals might actually fully understand all the details?
Well, I think with difficulty, but I think it's not quite that bad, because even though the technical details, the mathematics, etc., of some of the science we do is very hard for non-specialists to understand, I think it is possible to get over the key ideas fairly free of technicalities. I think we can.
You're a master of this with cosmology.
Well, we try. It is difficult, and in fact, it's more difficult than people realise, because you have to obviously avoid too much mathematics, and you have to avoid technical words.
You're not 100% truthful, right? It's very difficult to be honest, totally honest.
That's right, yes.
Sharing your results.
Yes, but you've got to simplify, obviously, but hopefully in an honest way. And as Einstein or Bohr said, you should make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that's a good rule.
Yes.
But I think from my own experience of doing this, I think I've managed to understand you've got to avoid mathematics and technical words. But there's one particularly difficult thing to avoid, which is everyday words being used in a special context.
Yes.
And let me give you two examples. One is the word degenerate,
yes.
which we know has a particular meaning in mathematics.
A negative meaning in general feeling.
Yes, whereas in mathematics it's got a technical meaning. And,
yes.
A line is a degenerate case for a triangle, etc.
Yes.
That's one. And another example, which comes up in climate change, is feedback. Because if you want to say that as the Earth warms, then it may release methane from the tundra, and this is positive feedback.
Yes.
Okay? You use the word positive feedback, but to most people, positive feedback sounds like what happens after you've had a job appraisal and you come out well. So positive feedback sounds a good thing.
Great job. You did a great job.
So that's an example of where the technical phrase can be misunderstood.
Yes.
So we've got to be careful about avoiding using everyday words in a sense which is different from the...
It's like a medical test that comes out negative, which
yes.
is a good thing.
Yes, that's right, yes.
So, talking about kind of science and being a scientist, what would you say are some of the qualities, successful qualities that a scientist... What are some of the qualities that a scientist should have or can have?
Yes. Well, obviously, the ability to understand some technical details,
yes.
certain mathematical skill, and now, of course, computer skills as well. But also, I suppose, the motive to try and understand something and accept that most of your early ideas are going to be wrong, and also accept that there are some problems which you'll never solve. I think one of the differences between lay people and experts is that lay people don't realize that some problems are really too difficult to solve. I mean, and the balance between what's easy and what's difficult is rather surprising. I mean, I would give an example from my own field of astronomy, that I expect people to believe me if I tell them about what happens when two black holes a billion light years away collide with each other, and why we've got evidence for that. But on the other hand, you are foolish to believe any expert on childcare or diet,
yes.
which are things that everyone cares about and understands. And that's because it's a fallacy to think that everyday problems are the easy problems. They're also the hardest problems. Anything to do with human beings is far harder to understand than anything in the inanimate world. It's a fallacy to think that they're easy to understand, just like people sometimes say that it should be easier to cure the common cold than other diseses, just because it's common, but that doesn't mean it. And so people don't have a feeling for what can be done and what can't be. And of course, one of the knacks of being a scientist is to choose a topic to work on which is not trivial, nor, on the other hand, so intractable that you won't make any progress at all.
So talking about the motivation of scientists, I think these motivations come in various kind of flavors. I mean, some people want to understand the world, others want to change it. Or, I mean, how do you see this?
Well, I think as human beings, we want to change the world.
Yes.
But our understanding is separate from that. But I think among scientists, there is a great variety of mental types.
Yes.
I mean, I'd be surprised by this because, my professional life, like yours, is lived among a fairly homogeneous group of people, all with many common interests. But even among them, I think we see quite a variety of personality types in those who think pictorially, those who think in terms of equations, those who like computers, those who don't like computers, and also those who like to solve problems in a sort of step-by-step piecemeal way, and those who are happy to sort of think in a more open-ended way about big problems.
What do you think is the role of kind of imagination in science?
I think imagination is crucial, but it's sort of constrained imagination. It's not quite like perhaps it's rather like sort of composing in a fugue or writing a sonnet, where you're trying to do something creative but within a standard form. And so science is something where any idea has to be embedded in the huge edifice that's already been built up by your predecessors. But clearly, you've got to make some insight, and unless you make some new insight, then all you do is going to add something which anyone else could have done as well.
I think Feynman said that science is creativity in a straitjacket.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What about playfulness?
Well, I think that is part of it. I mean, I think Feynman also said that you've got to keep some childhood instincts alive. And if I think of one of the most creative scientists I know, who is Roger Penrose,
yes.
He's a good example of someone who thinks very visually. He thinks not only deeper than the rest of us, but more differently, more pictorially than most of us. And he's an example of someone whose recreations have been creative, in thinking of his tiling in pentagonal quasi-crystal patterns, and also he, with his father, who was a psychologist, invented these impossible figures, which inspired Escher, who we already knew to devise some of his new diagrams of the endless staircase, etc. So Penrose is an example of someone who you can't really meet without recognizing as someone who is especially creative in a sort of playful way, as well as obviously a very deep way.
I think this famous quote of Einstein, basically to the effect that imagination is more important than knowledge, because imagination is capturing everything that's yet to be known.
That's
so
right.
do you feel that in some sense we also have to be aware of the opportunity to understand something, that there are certain questions that perhaps current generations aren't even aware is a question that could be answered?
Well, I think that's true. You've got to be aware of some problems which have become tractable and become timely, and work on them, but at the same time you don't want to work on something which is impossible. But I think one thing which has happened, and this is perhaps something which is a downside of being a scientist, is that science has become a much larger enterprise with more mixed motives involved.
Yes.
And the number of new insights has certainly not gone up in proportion to the number of people who would call themselves scientists. And that's partly because science is becoming more technical, more detailed, needs bigger equipment, etc. But partly also because there are more commercial pressures, etc. So it makes it different.
What about the social elements to it? I think these days, you can probably argue that being a scientist is much more, the interconnectivity of science and the fact that collaborations are becoming larger. Do you see there another development?
Well, of course, the type of science which is done if you're in a big team is different. And, it's certainly true that many people who have been original scientists, worked in the pioneering stage of a subject, they would not like to be part of the group at CERN, where you're one of 1,000 people working on a big experiment. That's a quasi-industrial organization. And I think one has to warn young people that if they want to do science, they've got to realize that some kind of science is like being in industry, with some of the downsides, without some of the benefits, whereas some allows you to be more individual and to make your own reputation independent of what
about
you're
the
experiencing.
global element? We here in the Vatican, but we have colleagues all over the world. Do you see some kind of convergence happening if you look at science across the globe?
Well, I think one very benign change is that science is being done more globally. I mean, it used to be done mainly in North America and Europe, whereas now the rise of science in Asia and other parts of the world is surely benign. And I think we must accept that the hegemony of the Western world, which has existed for 400 years, is going to end, because it's going to be in Asia that the world's economic and intellectual capital is going to be concentrated from now on. And so it's going to get more global. But of course, the problems which science needs to tackle are very often global problems. And so it's very appropriate that scientists should collaborate with people all across the world in dealing with energy resources and
Do you
climate.
see it as truly one global community?
This certainly is. I mean, of course, some scientists, of course, aren't part of it.
Yes.
But I think clearly the scientists who we have at Vatican meetings who work on the environment or on healthcare, etc., they're part of some global community, and what they care about are global problems. And the key thing is to ensure that their voice spreads beyond academia
Yes.
To those who can really change the world.
Thinking about coming back again to your own field, cosmology. So let's kind of zoom out and we're looking at the universe, and we see here planet Earth, and we have this group of scientists trying to understand, well, the planet, ourselves, but also the universe. How do you see this from a cosmic perspective? What are we exactly doing here on this planet?
Well, of course, we don't know. I think the more one understands about any phenomenon, the more amazed one is by it. I mean, I think when I look at an insect now, I'm more amazed by an insect when I realize all the chemical processes that have to happen if it's just simply to move his leg. You know, and one realizes how amazingly intricate the natural world is. And in that sense, the physical world of stars and galaxies is simpler than the biological world.
Yes.
But of course, it's got this sort of scale. And I think it's been a privilege to be working in a subject where our perspective has changed and expanded in the few decades. And of course, we've really had revolutions going back to the Copernican revolution, originally when we realized the Earth wasn't the center, and then we realized that our sun was just one star in a galaxy, and then our galaxy is just one of billions you can see with a large telescope.
Yes.
And I think we are now perhaps going to be due for a fourth Copernican revolution, when we will learn that physical reality is much more extensive than the domain we can see with even our biggest telescopes, because we can see with our biggest telescopes out to a sort of horizon, which is limited to the distance that light can have travelled to us from since the Big Bang. But there's nothing physically real about that horizon any more than there is about the horizon around you if you're on a boat in the middle of the ocean.
Yes.
We don't think that the ocean ends beyond that. And there are good reasons to think that the universe extends probably at least 1,000 times further than we can see. And probably much, much more than that. And that's not all, because that's all the aftermath of our Big Bang. And then the other question is whether our Big Bang is the only one. And there is a popular idea called the multiverse, where there are various variants, according to which there may be zillions of other Big Bangs, of which ours is just one. And they may all be governed by different physical laws from ours, we don't know. So it could be that there is an ecology of cosmoses on a scale far bigger than what we can observe. So our perception of overall physical reality is rather like the perception of a plankton in a spoonful of water of the entire Earth. You know, we're very limited.
But if you take this perspective, which is all kind of making us kind of less special.
Yes.
On the other hand, in the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the special nature of life on Earth. We don't know how special it is.
Right.
The fact that we have intelligent life.
Yes.
And the fact that we have life that is intelligent enough to look at the universe and have thoughts exactly like this. So the title of this series, we've chosen The Mind of the Universe. Perhaps you said A Mind of the Universe, which is this special role of us on planet Earth. Because certainly I think this is one of the few places, perhaps the only one, we don't know, where these kind of thoughts that you just kind of shared are generated.
Yes.
So again, looking at this vast hierarchy and our little plankton in a drop of water in a huge ocean, what is that special role we have in observing all of that?
Yes. Well, we clearly are special in being able to at least grasp the glimmerings of these huge ideas. It may be the post-human intelligence needed to grasp them more fully. But clearly, even though we don't know how common life is, it's clearly that we are living on a special planet this pale blue dot in the cosmos. And it's also equally clear, although less well appreciated, that we're living on at a special time, because this century is very special. It's the first when one species, namely the human species, can determine a planet's fate, and also the century when we can perhaps start a transition to a completely different form of intelligence based on electronics and machines, and perhaps spread beyond the Earth. So this century is special. So if you think of a space and time diagram, you know, this little dot in space and time is very special.
And if you spread around, we could be the mind of the universe.
Well, our descendants could be, yes.
Thank you very much.